appreciate the opportunity to talk, obviously, about a very important topic that's going on and probably unprecedented for the world in this for this coronavirus. I really wanted to. I mean, we could probably talk hours on this, and but I really, in the time I have, really cover on two key areas. One is around supply chain disruption that is and will happen throughout the world around pharmaceuticals. Secondly, I just want to cover a little bit about the therapies and what's being talked about as potential remedies and treatments for this virus. But let me start off with the supply chain disruption. And I think just for everyone's benefit, when you look at pharmaceuticals today, you have really two kind of major segments. You have the branded pharmaceuticals and you have generic pharmaceuticals. And typically within a country, around anything from 75 to 90% of the pharmaceuticals that are actually in the supply chain are generic pharmaceuticals. It may only amount for around 20% of the value, but in terms of the volume, we're talking about 75, 80. For the US, for example, is about 90% generic penetration. In the UK, it's about the same. And in most countries, the generic penetration is in the low to high 80s. So when we talk about generic pharmaceuticals, which dominate the volume, one thing that people may not be aware of is around 60 to 70% of the input raw materials that are used in generic pharmaceuticals come from two countries. One, China, and the second, India. So start with China, with the shutdown that really has happened since the middle to end of January, and the subsequent restrictions in shipping from the various ports, then clearly you can see that there is going to be a disruption in the supply chain as it pertains to obtaining raw materials for manufacturers in Australia, in Europe, in the US, to take that raw material and convert that into the finished dosage form that we all know, like the tablets, the capsules, the solutions, the injections, etc., etc. And so this China shutdown, even when they come back on stream, which they're expecting in China sooner than any other country because of the where the virus originated from, with pharmaceutical plants, it's not something that you can just switch on and switch off. There is a lag time, and that's going to take time to work itself through the supply chain. Similar with India now, they, as you probably all know, they've introduced a curfew as of midnight yesterday, and there's a 21-day shutdown of all businesses. And again, with India, there is going to be tremendous disruption. Take Australia, for example. A large proportion of the generic medicines which are used in Australia, either the raw material or the actual finished product, is actually exported from India into Australia. And so Australia, or whether it's Europe or whether it's the US, there is going to be, again, a downstream supply chain disruption because of the raw material or the finished dosage form. I want to kind of highlight on two particular molecules because I think it brings it to kind of like the kind of challenges that the pharma industry are facing. The first one is around paracetamol. Now, about 3 weeks ago, the World Health Organization and individual health authorities made a very important but drastic statement that the symptoms what you're experiencing, that patients are experiencing around fever and high temperature, etc., don't take ibuprofen, which most people were taking, because that can actually inflame an already weakened immune system. And the drug of choice to go to is paracetamol, or in the US, it's called acetaminophen. So as a result of that, everyone's now scrambling for paracetamol finished tablets or the raw material to make the finished tablets. And what has transpired now is that there is a global drug shortage of acetaminophen. The largest producer of the raw material in the world is India. And India have now decided that they're going to restrict exports of the raw material to ensure that Indian consumers and patients will not run out of paracetamol. So in that respect, companies now are scrambling to see where else we can get the raw material from, and then switching on their own local manufacturing plants to manufacture the finished product formulation. So again, in the space of 2 weeks, paracetamol, from what has been a 50, 60, 70-year-old drug that has been used very widely in the treatment of fever, has suddenly now become a scarce, rare product that every country and every health authority are trying to get stocks and supplies of. So that's one thing that we need to be aware of. And there's no question in my mind, Australia, whether it's the UK, whether it's Europe, there's going to be a drug shortage. I want to then go on to another drug called hydroxychloroquine. You've probably heard a lot about this, especially in the US, where President Trump has gone on record saying that, oh, this is a cure for COVID-19. It's actually an old 50-year-old drug that's used to treat malaria. And the theory goes that because malaria is also an infection, and there were a few cases in China that patients were treated with hydroxychloroquine, that this is going to be frontline and solve everyone's problems. Well, there's two issues here. One is there's been no clinical studies looking at hydroxychloroquine against COVID-19. Yes, a few patients doesn't mean that this can be actually approved for the use in COVID-19. And only as recent as yesterday in the US, a very reputable hospital basically said it's not working and you're actually better off just having an oxygen mask and bed rest. So this is something that, because it gets profiled, suddenly everyone's scrambling around for hydroxychloroquine. And again, there's a drug shortage, but really, is it going to make any difference in the treatment of COVID-19? Here lies another problem. That one of the largest manufacturers of the raw material hydroxychloroquine is currently banned from importing that material out of India because they have significant compliance challenges in their manufacturing plant. Well, what did the US do 2 days ago? They arbitrarily lifted the ban and is actually now saying we need the raw material of hydroxychloroquine from this plant in India. And so what was deemed as a high-risk facility to a week ago is now being deemed acceptable to go forward. And the reality is that as other drugs also become challenging in the supply chain, there's going to be health authorities who will then put away, park their compliance issues or their concerns with these facilities just to get access to the drugs. The question is then, if it's good enough now, why wasn't it good enough 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks ago? So there's going to be another challenge in terms of drug shortage there. And as I touched upon, really now all governments are pushing at their local manufacturers and say, how can we get security of supply by manufacturing in our own country versus import at a time when each country is trying to protect their own supply for their own citizens. So there is supply chain disruption already happening, and I expect to see that going out over the short to medium term, primarily in the raw materials, but also, as I said, in Australia, finished dosage form in generics are coming from areas which are currently in lockdown. Let me just move on to therapies now. You've heard a lot of governments and physicians and clinicians and scientists talking about what could be used, what is being researched into the treatment of COVID-19. As we all know, this is a new virus. There is no, today, cure for that virus. There is no vaccine for that virus. and any of the medicines that are being tried have not been clinically shown to be effective to treat COVID-19. So let me start by vaccines. Now, everyone jumps on the bandwagon. Yes, vaccines, and a lot of companies you've heard already in the US and in Australia, actually, whether it's a Gilead, a Johnson Johnson, a GlaxoSmithKline, some of the smaller biotech companies called like Moderna or Inovia, they're all developing a vaccine. The problem is timelines for developing vaccines are long. And whatever the politicians are saying that we can get a vaccine in 2, 3, 4 months is just talk. The real reality is it takes around minimum 12, but probably more like 18 months to develop a vaccine. The challenge we have with COVID-19, though, because this is a new virus, there are likely to be new variants or new mutations of the virus that will mean that the vaccine that is currently being developed may not be effective, say, for the second wave when we hit the next winter season in the Northern Hemisphere, for example, in November, December, January of 2020, 2021. Already, there's a group in Iceland which is saying that they've discovered 40 mutations of COVID-19 already. If you look at influenza, because everyone knows about influenza and the flu jab, the reason why 1 year the flu jab is more effective than a previous year is that because it's not effective the following year because the virus, the influenza strain, mutates into a new variant. And so the vaccine is always playing catch up. But we know a lot about the influenza virus, and so sometimes we can be ahead of the curve. With COVID-19, we don't know how it's going to mutate. We don't know what variant or what strain is going to exist 6 months, 9 months from now. And so vaccines, yes, they will have, eventually there will be a vaccine that will give large immunity to a large number of populations, but we don't know how effective the first wave of this vaccine is going to be. We then talk about other medicines that currently are not registered for COVID-19. We've heard about hydroxychloroquine, as I mentioned, an old anti-malaria drug. We've now got antiretroviral drugs that are being used in HIV that are being tested. There is one Roche drug that is showing very promising data in 19 patients in China. But again, to actually do the proper clinical studies that any normal approved drug requires, it takes time. You've got to get the patients, you've got to design the studies, you've got to evaluate the data, and then you have to look for the approval. In a crisis like this, in a pandemic, it's always a risk versus benefit. And so, yes, we may not know about the safety or the side effects, but if we can see efficacy, should our health authorities take the risk at the expense of safety and side effects? So that's always the balance that any drug and any regulatory agency, whether it's the TGA in Australia, the FDA in US, et cetera, is a risk going to outweigh the benefit. The other problem, which people are just now getting their heads around, is that when these clinical trials are conducted, patients have to travel to clinical trial centers to get the drug administered. Well, in the lockdown, which is now affecting almost a third of the global population, how are these patients going to travel to the clinical trial center to get these treatments to do the clinical trials that the regulatory authorities require, the health authorities require? There's going to be a slowdown in the clinical trial recruitment, which means a slowdown in the overall R&D, which means there's going to be a slowdown in getting those medicines, new therapies approved. The last thing, which I will make a little plug now, having now working in the cannabis industry, is that quite interestingly, and again, especially in the US, many people now are relying on cannabis as a first line of defense for a range of medical issues, whether you've got inflammation, whether you've got pain, whether you've got anxiety and depression. And as a result of COVID-19, it's not just the primary symptoms of fever, dry cough, pain that is really being looked at. People are now getting anxious. They're not sure about their jobs. They're not sure about their situation in terms of their longevity in their companies, what's going to happen with their children, their schooling, etc., etc. So again, we're not so much in where there's legalized cannabis, people now, there's been a big upturn in sales where people are now looking to cannabis to help them address many of these other secondary conditions rather than going to traditional pharmaceutical medicines. So in summary, when we look at what the impact is on the pharma industry, short term, I'm predicting drug shortages, whether it's on ones which are being used to treat symptoms of COVID, or whether there are other drugs which are part of the supply chain where they're originating out of China and India, and even Europe now, with the lockdown in Europe. A large amount of raw material is manufactured in Spain and Italy. Well, those two countries obviously are the two epicenters in Europe for COVID-19. So again, even within Europe, we're likely to see significant drug shortages. The short-term opportunity, though, does exist for local pharma. So in other words, manufacturing companies who have facilities in that country can actually start trying manufacturing locally. But unlike many other industries, to switch on a pharmaceutical plant isn't easy. It takes time to get your equipment all validated, your ingredients in place, and getting everything lined up to switch these on. It's not something that we can do overnight. But many local pharmaceutical companies are now very much running against the clock to see, can we manufacture locally to get security of supply in their own respective country. In the medium term, though, you're going to see cost escalation, because when you look at India and China, they save up to around 40% of the costs for Americans, Europeans, Australians. They get savings because the raw materials coming from China and India. If those raw materials are not available, then costs are going to go up. And again, that's going to affect the viability of a lot of companies, their ability to invest in the future in new R&D therapies, and so on and so forth. And that's going to then have an impact on their bottom line. And what's going to happen? Jobs are going to get lost. When there's a job losses, people get worried, they get ill, they get anxious, they need medication. They're not available. And so the drug shortages spiral out of control. So it's a vicious circle. In the long term, as I said, typically pharmaceutical companies will cut down their R&D spend. It may be difficult, as I said, to access patients to do the studies. And there will be a delay in bringing out new therapies in the long run as investment slows down. Now, there is an opportunity there's an increased use of artificial intelligence to identify new targets. But again, the regulatory processes will always ultimately drive the timelines of bringing these new therapies. And I think it's going to be, apart from the odd situation where the regulatory authority might fast track one or two therapies, in general, they're going to take the average time of developing a new molecule is going to be in the order of 2, 3, 4 years to bring out those new therapies. I don't think you can take any shortcuts at this point in time. So
Jeremy,
I think
Jeremy, just to jump in, because we are sort of running short of time. I believe Ryan just had Ryan Corrigan from Rare Capital just had one quick question around the hydroxychloroquine.
Hydroxychloroquine, correct?
Yeah, Ryan, are you keen to ask that question still?
Yeah. You just want to read it out?
You go for it, mate.
How do I get back to that?
Oh, okay, that other one.
All right. Yeah, there was a study in south of France that did 36 patients on it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they did 4 groups they split the groups of 4 people, and gave them a very small dosage over 6 days, and it said that 70% of the hydroxychloroquine treated patients were cured of COVID at day 6, and only 12.5% of the control group were cured of COVID-19 at day 6. So they saw a dramatic effectiveness of using the combination of those drugs.
Yes. No, and again, I haven't seen that particular study, but there are multiple studies going on at the moment, and that's what I was about to say. Typically, to bring a molecule to market with a indication, you're talking about doing studies in hundreds, if not thousands, of patients, so that statistically you can actually ensure that this data is real.
Yeah. In a study, I think that's underway. It's probably underway as we speak.
Correct. But in the same token, there was a study that came out in the US yesterday, and 4 patients died of taking hydroxychloroquine because of the side effects, and because I think they were taking a dosage which was higher than what was recommended. So again, what needs to happen is a collation, all the metadata, and all the data, dose ranging studies, and statistically what we call randomized control studies that will then determine whether this is a real effect, is it a placebo effect, is it only working in a subset of patients, etc., etc. So yes, that study is promising, but whether that is actually going to then support, this is going to be the cure, too early to tell.
Yeah. Great. And also, how about the dependence on generic drugs? What would it take, dollar-wise, politically, and business and sort of enterprise and construction? What would it take for the US to become self-reliant and make their own generic drugs?
The biggest problem is the manufacturing capability and capacity does exist in the US. The problem is always in generic drugs is the cost. And with the current cost of generic drugs, which are a fraction of your branded drugs,
right.
This is the problem is, so just to give you an example, when a product is still on patent and it's been, I'll take an example, an antidepressant drug, when it was like Zolpidem, it was charging in the US $400 for a bottle of 100. The day it went off patent, generic drugs, the generic price in the US was $1 for a price of 100. So within hours of it coming off patent, the price crashes. And with the raw material not being manufactured in the US, because those plants have all shut down many years ago because of the low-cost manufacturing in China and India, the big problem still is availability of the raw material. If they get the raw material, can they then manufacture in the US? For sure they can manufacture in the US. Can they actually, are companies prepared to do that because there is enough margin in the product? That's always going to be the financial equation that companies are going to have to figure out whether it makes sense. Now, in a pandemic, I think people will, but can they get access to the raw material to actually make the finished product?
Yeah,
so maybe the US will want to diversify their supply for the raw material. Yeah. Maybe they need China, India, and maybe a third and a fourth option as well.
Correct. I mean, Europe actually was pretty much US's backup option prior to this pandemic, when there were significant quality issues coming out of China and India. Then the US turned to Europe because, as I mentioned earlier, Italy and Spain are two large producers of raw materials. problem is, in this pandemic, those two countries are also in lockdown as well, so they can't rely on Europe. And as I said, there's very little raw material manufacturing that goes on in the US, because again, all that got shipped out 10, 15, 20 years ago.
So fascinating stuff. Jeremy, that was great, and I think we're all keenly listening, and definitely there's a lot of issues that the pharmaceutical industry need to overcome to even get close with solving this huge problem. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll throw it over to Victor now.